which, much to his growing consternation, didn't happen. Why he would feel any sort of consternation over such a thing was beyond him, but there it was. Linus was learning that whatever feelings Arthur Parnassus evoked in him were temporary and the result of proximity. Linus didn't have many friends, perhaps, if he was being honest with himself, none at all, and considering Arthur Parnassus a friend was a nice idea, however impractical it might be. They couldn't be friends. Linus was here as a caseworker for Dicomy. Arthur was a master of an orphanage. This was an investigation, and getting too familiar with one of the subjects of said investigation wasn't proper. The rules and regulations were clear on that. A caseworker, it read, must remain objective. Objectivity is of the utmost importance for the health and well-being of the magical youth. They cannot look to depend upon a caseworker, as the caseworker is not their friend. Linus had a job to do, which meant he couldn't sit around hoping to speak to Arthur without little ears around. And while Linus believed the sessions between Arthur and Lucy were fascinating, his time couldn't be spent with just them. There were 5 other children to consider, and he needed to make sure it didn't look as if he were playing Vinny favorites. He went with Talia to her garden, listening as she extolled the virtues, the many, many virtues, of working in the dirt. He followed Fee and Zoe into the woods while Zoe talked about the importance of listening to the earth around them, to the trees and the grass and the birds. He listened as Chauncey regaled him with the tales of famous bellhops, most of whom Linus believed were fictional, who opened doors and carried luggage and solved crimes such as jewelry theft or brought up trays for room service. He brought out a thick tome, almost the length of the rules and regulations, from underneath his bed, wrapped in plastic to keep it from getting wet. He grunted as he lifted it above his head to show Linus the article, the plastic crinkling, the history of bellhops through the ages. I've read it 4.5 times, he announced proudly. Have you? Linus asked. Oh, yes, I have to make sure I know what I'm doing. Why? Chauncey blinked slowly, first his right eye and then his left. Why what? Why do you wish to become a bellhop? Chauncey grinned. Because they get to help people. And that's what you want to do? His smile faded quickly. More than anything, I know he clacked his black teeth. Different. Linus startled. No, that's not there's not a single thing wrong with you. I know, Chauncey said. Different doesn't mean bad. Arthur says being different is sometimes better than being the same as everyone else. He looked at the book clutched in his tentacles. When people come to hotels, they're usually tired. They want someone to help them carry their bags. And I'm really good at it. Talia asks me to lift heavy things for her all the time so I can practice. He frowned, looking down at his book. Just because I look the way I do doesn't mean I can't help people. I know some people think I'm scary, but I promise I'm really not. Of course you aren't, Linus said quietly. He nodded toward the book. Go on, then. Let's hear about these bellhops throughout the ages. I believe it will be positively riveting. Chauncey's eyes bounced excitedly. Oh, it is. Did you know that the first use of the word bellhop was in 1897? They're also called porters or bellmen. Isn't that amazing? It is, Linus said. Perhaps the most amazing thing I've ever heard. He sat with Theodore near his nest, never in because he didn't want to be bitten, listening to the wyvern chirp as he showed Linus each of his little treasures, a button, a silver coin, another button, a folded up piece of paper with what looked like Sal's handwriting on it. What it said, Linus couldn't tell. Yet another button. And he asked them, each of them, if they were happy, if they had any concerns, if anything scared them here on the island. He'd asked similar questions before at other orphanages, and he could always tell when the children had been coached to say what they thought he needed to hear. There was always a note of artifice to their bright words of happiness and joy, and no, Mr. Baker, absolutely nothing is wrong here, and I'm filled with joy. It wasn't like that here. Here, Talia would stare at him suspiciously and demand to know why he was asking, and did she need to get her shovel? Here, Fee would laugh and tell him she didn't want to be anywhere else because these were her trees and her people. Here, Lucy grinned at him and said, "Oh, yes, Mr. Baker, I would like to go somewhere else one day, but only if all the others came with him and agreed on his ideas of world domination." Here, Chauncey's eyes would bounce and he'd say he loved the island, but that he did wish there was a hotel here so he could carry luggage. Here, Theodore would stumble over his wings in excitement at seeing Arthur, even if Arthur had only been gone for a few minutes. And it was here, on the Thursday near the end of the second week, that Sal appeared at 5:15 on the porch of the guest house, gnawing on his bottom lip. Linus opened the door after hearing a knock, surprised to find Sal by himself. He leaned out, sure that one of the other children would be there hiding, but no, it was just Sal. Linus quickly schooled his face, not wanting to scare the boy. "Hello, Sal." Sal's eyes widened, and he took a step back. He glanced over his shoulder, and even though Linus couldn't see him, he was sure Arthur was watching from somewhere. He didn't know how he knew, but Linus was under the impression that not much happened on the island without Arthur knowing. Sal turned back toward Linus and lowered his gaze to the floor. His hands were in fists at his sides, and he was breathing heavily. Linus was getting worried that something was wrong, but then Calliope walked through Linus's legs and began to rub against Sal. She meowed loudly at him, arching her back, ears twitching. Sal smiled softly down at her and seemed to relax. "She's a good cat," Linus said quietly. "Gives me a bit of trouble every now and then, but nothing I can't handle." "I like cats," Sal said, voice barely above a whisper. "Most times they don't like me, because of the dog thing." "Calliope's a little different. She likes you." Sal looked up at him. "Really?" Linus shrugged. "Do you hear the way she's talking to you?" Sal nodded. "I've never heard her do that before. Oh, she purrs like a normal cat, but she never meows, at least not until we got here, and not until she met you." Sal looked shocked. "Wow," he said, looking back down at her. "I wonder why." "I like to think it's because she's a good judge of character, that perhaps she senses something in you that allows her to speak. Cats are very smart that way. If they sense someone isn't a good person, they tend to avoid them or even attack them." "She's never attacked me," Sal said. "I know. She likes you." Sal scratched the back of his neck. "I like her too." "Good," Linus said, "because as much as cats can tell about people, you can always judge a person by how they treat animals. If there is cruelty, then that person should be avoided at all costs. If there is kindness, I like to think it's the mark of a good soul." "I'm kind to animals," Sal said, sounding more animated than Linus had ever heard him, "and they always seem to like me." "How about that?" Linus said, amused. "I'm so very pleased to hear it." Sal flushed and looked away. When he spoke again, he mumbled something Linus couldn't quite make out. "Say that again, please. I didn't hear it." Sal took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I was wondering if I could show you my room." Linus kept his voice even, though he was more thrilled than he expected to be. "I would like that," he hesitated. "Did anyone put you up to this? Because I don't want you doing something you're not ready for." Sal shrugged awkwardly. "Arthur said before you got here that you'd want to see it, but he's never brought it up again." Linus was relieved. "And none of the other children?" He shook his head. "No, I mean, I know you've already seen their rooms, but they didn't say anything." Linus wanted to know why now, but decided to keep that to himself. He didn't need to put more pressure on the boy. "Then I would be delighted." "Can Calliope come too?" Sal asked in a rush. "If that's okay. I don't want to cause trouble for anyone." Linus held up a hand. "Absolutely, though we'll leave that up to her. If she follows, which I expect she will, then so be it." "Okay. Shall we?" Sal gnawed on his lip again before nodding tightly. Linus closed the door to the guest house behind him. Calliope came with them, as Linus thought she would. She continued to walk up to Sal, only going a few feet ahead before turning and coming back to him. Linus almost felt put out by her obvious show of affection, but since he was a 40-year-old man and not a sullen teenager, he didn't say a word. Besides, he told himself she was obviously helping, and Linus wasn't going to say no to that. In the garden, they passed Talia, who only waved before turning back to her flowers. Chauncey was next to her, exclaiming loudly that the flowers were the most beautiful things he'd ever seen, and that if she were so inclined, he'd like to eat a few of them. Thea and Zoe were in the woods. Lucy was with Arthur in his room. Before they reached the stairs, Theodore chirped. Linus looked up to see the wyvern hanging from an exposed beam above them as if he thought he were a bat. He made another sound, and Sal said, "It's okay, Theodore. I asked him to come." Theodore chirped again before closing his eyes as Linus followed Sal up the stairs. They paused in front of the door to Sal's room. Sal, who never stopped looking nervous most days, put a shaking hand on the doorknob. Linus said, "If you're not ready, then you're not ready. I won't push you on this, Sal. Please don't do this on my account." Sal frowned as he glanced back at Linus. "But this is on your account." Linus was flummoxed. "Well, yes, I suppose it is, but we have all the time in the world." They didn't, of course. Linus was almost halfway through his stay on Marsyas. The realization startled him. Sal shook his head. I would rather we do it now." "If you wish, I won't touch anything of yours if that makes you feel better. And if there's anything you want to show me, I will gladly look at it. I'm not here to judge you, Sal, not at all." "Then why are you here if not to judge?" Linus balked. I'm here to make sure this home is exactly that, a home, one that I can trust to keep all of you safe and sound." Sal dropped his hand from the doorknob. He turned fully toward Linus. Calliope sat near his feet looking up at him. This was as close as Linus had ever been to Sal. He was as tall as Linus was, and though Linus was thicker, Sal had a heft to him, a strength that belied how small he tried to make himself seem at times. "Are you going to make me leave?" Sal asked, that frown deepening. Linus hesitated. He had never lied to any child in his life. If the truth needed to be stretched, he would rather say nothing at all. "I don't want to make you do anything you don't want to," Linus said slowly, "and I don't think anyone should." Sal studied him carefully. "You're not like the others." "Others?" "Caseworkers." "Oh, I suppose not. I'm Linus Baker. You've never met a Linus Baker before." Sal stared at him for a moment longer before turning back to the door. He pushed it open and then stepped back. He began to gnaw on his lip again, and Linus wanted to tell him he was going to hurt himself, but he asked, "May I?" Sal nodded jerkily. The room was nothing fancy. In fact, it seemed to be devoid of almost anything that Linus would associate with Sal. The other children had made their spaces their own, for better or worse. Here, the walls were blank. The bed was neatly made. There was a rug on the wooden floor, but it was muted and gray. There was a door to a closet, and that was it, mostly. In one corner, there was a pile of books that reminded Linus of Arthur's office. He looked at a few of the titles and saw they were fictional classics, Shakespeare and Poe, Dumas and Sartre. The last caused Linus to arch an eyebrow. He had never quite understood existentialism. But other than that, the room was a blank canvas, as if waiting for an artist to bring it to life. It saddened Linus because he suspected he knew the reason why it was the way it was. "It's lovely," he said, making a production of looking around. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sal peeking through the doorway, tracking his every movement. "Quite spacious, and just look out the window. Why, I think I can almost see the village from here. A wonderful view." "You can see the lights from the village at night," Sal said from the doorway. "They sparkle. I like to pretend they're ships at sea." "A pretty thought," Linus said. He stepped away from the window and went to the closet. "Is it all right if I look in here?" There was a brief hesitation. Then, "Okay." The closet was bigger than Linus expected, and there, next to a chest of drawers, was a small desk with a rolling chair tucked in underneath. Atop the desk sat a typewriter, an old Underwood. There was a blank sheet of paper already threaded through. "What's this, then?" Linus asked lightly. He didn't hear a response. He looked back over his shoulder to see Sal standing next to the bed, looking like a lost little boy. Calliope hopped up onto the bed and rubbed against his hand. He spread his fingers into the hair on her back. "Sal?" "It's where I write." Sal blurted, eyes wide. I like to write. It's not very good, and I probably shouldn't. Ah, I seem to remember something about that. Last week in your class, you read something for everyone. You wrote it? Sal nodded. It was very good, far better than I could ever write, I'm afraid. If you need a report filled out, I'm your man, but that's as far as my creativity extends with the written word. No computer? The light hurts my eyes, and I like the sound of the typewriter better. Linus smiled. I understand. There's something magical about the clack of the keys that a computer can't emulate. I should know. Most days I sit in front of one at work. It can hurt my eyes, too, after a time, though I believe your vision is a little sharper than mine. I don't want to talk about what I write, Sal said quickly. Of course, Linus said easily. It's private. I would never ask you to share something you aren't ready to. That seemed to appease Sal slightly. It doesn't make sense sometimes, my thoughts, and I try to write them all down in order, but he looked as if he were struggling to find the right words. It's personal, Linus said, and you'll find the order when you're ready. If it's anything like what you read previously, I'm sure it's going to be quite moving. How long have you been writing? 2 months, maybe a little less. So only since he'd been at Marsyas. Not before? Sal shook his head. No one ever let me before until I came here. Arthur? Sal scuffed a shoe against the rug. He asked me what I wanted more than anything. For the first month, he asked me once a week, telling me when I was ready to answer, he'd do whatever he could within reason. And you said a typewriter? No. He looked down at Calliope. I told him I didn't want to have to move again, that I wanted to stay here. Linus blinked against the sudden and unexpected burn in his eyes. He cleared his throat. And what did he say? That he'd do whatever he could to make sure that happened. And then I asked for a typewriter. Zoe brought it the next day, and the others found the desk in the attic and cleaned it up. Talia said she polished it until she thought her beard was going to fall off from all the chemicals, and then they surprised me with it. His lips curved up. It was a good day, almost like it was my birthday. Linus crossed his arms to keep his hands from shaking. And you put it in the closet? I should think it would look nice in front of the window. Sal shrugged. The closet helped me feel small. I wasn't ready to be bigger yet. I wonder if you're ready now, Linus mused aloud. Your room is a little bigger than the closet, but not so big that it feels like all the walls have fallen away. It's like the village at night. You can see them, but they can't see you, though there is all that space between you. A little perspective, I think. Sal looked down. I hadn't thought of it that way. Just an idea. The desk is perfect where it is, if that's what you want. It doesn't need to be moved until you're ready, or even at all. For all I know, the window might prove to be a distraction. Do you have a window where you work? Linus shook his head. He thought this was dangerously personal, but did it really hurt anyone? I don't. Dicomie isn't, well, they're not fond of windows, I think. Dicomie, Sal spat, and Linus cursed inwardly. I don't. It is where I work, Linus said, but you knew that, and you said yourself that I wasn't like the others. Sal's hands were furled into fists again. You could be. Perhaps, Linus admitted, and I can see why you'd think that with all that you've been through. But I want you to remember that you have nothing to prove to me. I have to prove myself to you that I have your best interests in mind. Arthur is good, Sal said. He's not like the others, the masters. He's not mean. I know that. But you said you were investigating him. Linus frowned. I don't think I've ever said that aside from a private conversation. How did you? I'm a dog, Sal snapped at him. My hearing is better. I could hear you. You said it wasn't a visit. It was an investigation. I wasn't trying to listen, but that's what the others said too, that they were investigating. It's why I never get to put things up in my room like Talia or Lucy, because it's always temporary. Any time I've ever thought I was going to finally have a place to stay, it was taken from me. He cursed inwardly. That isn't for you to hear. Sal began to shrink away from him like Linus had raised a hand to him. No, Linus said quickly, that's not What I meant was, I should have been more aware of what I said. I should have been more careful with my words. So you're not investigating Arthur? Linus started to shake his head but stopped. He sighed. It's not Arthur, Sal, or at least it's not just Arthur. It's the orphanage as a whole. I know you've had less than desirable experiences in the past, but I swear to you this is different. He didn't know if he believed his own words or not. Sal eyed him warily. And what happens if you decide to make us leave? Won't you be the same then? I don't know, Linus said quietly. I hope if there is a reason for such an action, you would be aware of it. Sal was quiet. Linus thought he had overstayed his welcome. He stepped away from the closet door. Calliope glared at him. He didn't blame her. He didn't think this had gone as well as he'd hoped. And while he'd told Sal earlier that they had all the time in the world, that wasn't true. Time, as always, moved more quickly than expected. In 2 weeks, he'd have to make his recommendation as he left the island behind. He gave Sal a wide berth, or as wide a berth as the room allowed for 2 large people. He smiled at him and was about to walk through the doorway when Sal said, "Could you help me?" "Yes," Linus said immediately. Then, with what? Sal looked down at Calliope, who wasn't quite done receiving attention, purring as he scratched her ears. His lips twitched again. He glanced up at Linus. "Moving my desk. I could probably do it on my own, but I don't want to scratch the walls or the floor in my room." Linus kept a neutral expression on his face. "If that's what you want." Sal shrugged as if indifferent, but Linus was good at what he did. He saw through the facade. Linus unbuttoned the sleeves of his shirt, rolling them up to his elbows. "I assume it fits through the closet doorway since you got it in there in the first place." Sal nodded. "Barely. We just have to be careful." Chauncey got too excited and chipped the corner of the desk. He felt really bad about it, but I told him it was okay. Sometimes things get chipped and broken, but there's still good in them. "Adds character, I think," Linus said, and allows for a reminder of a memory. "Ready?" Sal was. He walked into the closet first, pulling out the chair and setting the typewriter carefully on the seat. He pushed it back near the chest of drawers. He stood on one end of the desk and waited for Linus to reach the other. The desk was small but old. Linus expected it to be heavier than it looked. After they bent over and Sal counted to 3, he was proven right. It was heavy, and Linus remembered his mother saying, "Lift with your knees. Linus, honestly." The small twinge in his back reminded him he wasn't getting any younger, and he almost grinned ruefully at how little effort Sal appeared to exert. He probably could have moved it out by himself. They were careful as they carried the desk through the closet doorway. Linus could see the chip on the far corner of the desk, courtesy of Chauncey, and he shuffled back slowly. The desk fit through the doorway with an inch to spare on either side. "There," Linus huffed and puffed, "right there, in front of the window." They set it down carefully, avoiding pinching fingers. Linus groaned rather theatrically as he stood upright, hands going to the small of his back. He heard Sal chuckle, but he didn't acknowledge it outwardly. He wanted to hear such a sound again. Linus stepped back, eyeing their work critically. He put his hands on his hips and cocked his head. "It's missing something." Sal frowned. "Is it?" "Yes." He went back to the closet and pushed the chair out. He lifted the typewriter and set it in the middle of the desk in front of the window. He tucked the chair back underneath the desk. "There. Now it's finished." "Well, what do you think?" Sal reached out and traced a finger along the keys almost lovingly. "It's perfect." "I think so too. I expect your creativity to flourish even more with the muse through the window. Though, if it proves to be a distraction, we can always move it back to where it was. There's nothing wrong with that, so long as you remember that there is a big, wide world out there." Sal looked at him. "Do you know about the woman in the kitchen?" There was an incident at one of his previous orphanages. He was struck by a woman who worked in the kitchen for trying to take an apple. He retaliated in the only way he knew. She underwent the change the following week. Linus trod carefully. "Yes?" Sal nodded and stared back down at the typewriter. "I didn't mean to." "I know." I didn't know that would happen." "I know that too." Sal's chest hitched. I haven't done it since, and I won't do it again. I promise. Linus put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed, much like he'd seen Arthur do. He shouldn't have done it, but for once, he didn't care about the rules and regulations. I believe you. And though it trembled, Sal's smile was warm and bright. Chapter 12. There was a knock at the door to the guest house later that night. Linus frowned and glanced up from his report to look at the clock. It was almost 10, and he was about to call it a night. He was nearly finished, but his eyes were crossing, and the last yawn had been jaw-cracking. He decided to finish tomorrow, before having to mail off the report the day after. He stood from his chair. Calliope barely acknowledged him from her perch in the windowsill. She blinked slowly before curling her face back under her paws. Linus scrubbed a hand over his tired face as he went to the door. He was thankful he hadn't yet put on his pajamas. He didn't think it was proper to greet a late-night guest in sleep clothes, unless said guest was staying the night. He opened the door to find Arthur standing on the porch, pea coat pulled tightly around him. The nights were growing cooler, the wind off the sea carrying a bite to it. Arthur's hair was ruffled on his head, and Linus wondered what it felt like. "Good evening," Arthur said quietly. Linus nodded. "Arthur, is something wrong?" "Quite the opposite." "Oh, what is it?" "Do you mind?" Linus asked, nodding toward the house. "I brought you something." Linus squinted. "You have? I didn't ask for anything." "I know, you wouldn't." Linus, before he could even begin to ask what that meant, Arthur bent over and picked up a wooden box that lay at his feet on the porch. Linus took a step, and Arthur entered the guest house. Linus closed the door behind him as Arthur went into the living room. He glanced down at the report sitting in the chair, but Arthur didn't appear to try and read what was written upon it. "Working late?" "I am," Linus said slowly. "Finishing up, in fact. I hope you didn't come here to ask me what I've written. You know I can't tell you. The reports will be made available to you upon completion of the investigation as outlined in—" "I didn't come here to ask about your reports." That threw Linus off kilter. "You didn't? Then why are you here?" "As I've said, I brought you something. A gift. Here, let me show you." He set the box he carried down on the little table next to Linus's chair. He lifted the lid with his graceful fingers. Linus was intrigued. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been given a gift. Back at the office, birthday cards were passed around each year for the caseworkers, each signing their name with an inauthentic best wishes for whoever's birthday it was. The cards were cheap and impersonal, but Linus supposed it was the thought that counted. And aside from the holiday luncheon that extremely upper management put on, which was no gift at all, Linus hadn't received anything from anyone in a long time. His mother had long since passed, and even then she'd only given him socks or a wool hat or trousers that she told him he would have to grow into because they were dear and money didn't grow on trees. Honestly, Linus. "What is it?" he asked, more eager than he would have expected. He coughed. "What I mean to say is, I don't need anything from you." Arthur arched an eyebrow. "It's not about need, Linus. That's not what giving a gift is for. It's about the joy that someone is thinking of you." Linus felt his skin warm. "You were thinking about me?" "Constantly, though I can't claim credit for this." "No, this was Lucy's idea." "Oh my," Linus breathed. "I don't know if I want a dead animal or some such thing." Arthur chuckled as he looked down at the opened box. "That's good. If you should have wanted a dead animal, I'm certainly going about this the wrong way. I'm thrilled to say that this isn't something that used to be alive, though it can sound like it is." Linus wasn't sure if he wanted to see what was in the box exactly. Arthur was blocking it with his thin frame, and while Linus couldn't smell anything off-putting or hear anything squeaking, such as an overgrown rat with bare, beady eyes, he was still hesitant. "Well then, what is it?" "Why don't you come over here and see?" Linus took a deep breath and walked slowly toward Arthur. He cursed that the man was so tall. He would have to stand right next to him in order to be able to see what was inside. He chided himself. He doubted Arthur would allow Lucy to do anything untoward. At dinner, Lucy had been grinning at Linus the whole time, and though it had the same devilish tinge to it, Linus didn't think it was nefarious. Granted, Lucy was literally the son of the devil and had probably perfected innocence long ago. He hoped it wouldn't explode. He didn't like explosions, especially if he had to stand so close to one. But it wasn't a bomb, it wasn't a rat or a dead rotting carcass. It was a vintage portable record player. Across the inside, the lid of the box was the word Zenith, the Z in the shape of a lightning bolt. Linus gasped. "Look at this! It's wonderful! Why, I don't think I've seen such a thing in a very long time, and even then it was only through store windows. The Victrola I have at home is much too large, and I know the sound isn't as grand from these little portables, but I've always wondered what it would be like to take music with you wherever you went, like perhaps on a picnic or something." He was babbling, and he didn't know why. He closed his mouth with an audible snap of his teeth. Arthur smiled. Lucy hoped you would react as such. He wanted to be here to give it to you himself, but decided it would be best coming from me. Linus shook his head. "It's thoughtful. Please tell him thank you for—" "No, I can do it myself tomorrow, first thing at breakfast." And then another thought struck him. "Oh, but I don't have any records to play. I didn't even think to bring any from home, and even if I had, I probably wouldn't have run the risk. They're flimsy, and I wouldn't like to see them break." "Oh," Arthur said, "Lucy thought of that too." He pressed his thumb against a latch on the underside of the lid, and a little compartment opened. Inside were a blank white sleeve. Inside was a blank white sleeve with a blank black record inside. "What a marvel," Linus said, itching to reach out and touch the box. "Where did this come from? It looks brand new." "I assure you it's not. Quite old, actually. I'm sure you saw the many boxes in the attic when you went to see Theodore's nest." He had. They were stacked off in the corners in the shadows. He'd wondered at them, but figured they were just evidence of a life of an old house. Material possessions tend to grow unabated when you least expected it. "I did." Arthur nodded. "It sat in a box near the back for the longest time. We haven't had need for it, seeing as how we already have 3 record players in the house in use. Lucy, as he's wont to do, discovered it while snooping. It was dusty and in need of a polish, but he was careful. Sal helped." He looked down at it. "To be honest, we probably should have tested it before I brought it over. I'm not even sure if this old thing works." "And the record?" Arthur shrugged. "Lucy wouldn't let me see what it was, said it was a surprise, but that he thought you would like it." That set Linus a little on edge, but less so than it would have when he first arrived on the island. "Well, I suppose we should find out if he's right." Arthur took a step back. "Would you like to do the honors?" "Of course." He took Arthur's place and took the sleeve from the compartment. He slid the record out carefully. It too was blank, with no picture in the center frame. He set the sleeve aside as he placed the record on the platter, the small stacking spindle sticking up in the middle. He flipped the switch on the side of the player and was delighted when the record began to spin, crackling quietly. "I think we're in business," he murmured. "It would appear so," Arthur replied. He lowered the needle. The speakers crackled a little louder, and then a man began to sing, "Saying, darling, you send me. I know you send me." "Sam Cooke," Linus whispered. He dropped his hand back to his side. Oh, that's wonderful." He looked up to find Arthur staring at him, just as Sam sang about how he thought it was infatuation, but that it had lasted so long. Linus took a step back. Arthur smiled. "Can we sit?" Linus nodded, suddenly unsure of himself, which wasn't anything new. The room felt stuffy, and he was lightheaded. He was probably just tired. It had been a long day. He picked his report up off the chair before sitting down. He set it on the side table next to the record player as Sam continued on woo-wooing. Arthur sat in the remaining chair. Their feet were so close, Linus noticed, that if he extended his leg a little, the toes of their shoes would touch. "I heard the strangest thing tonight," Arthur said. Linus looked up at him, hoping Arthur couldn't read his thoughts on his face. "What would that be?" "I was telling the children good night. I start in order, you know, from one end of the hall to the other. Lucy's always last, given that his room is in mine. But Sal is second to last, and before I knocked on his door, I heard some new happy sounds that I did not expect." Linus fidgeted in his seat. I'm sure it's normal. He is a teenage boy after all. They like to explore so long as you remind them that, oh, I know, Arthur said, fighting a smile. No, it wasn't that. Linus's eyes bulged. Oh dear, that's not, I didn't mean, good heavens, what on earth is wrong with me? Arthur covered an obvious laugh with a cough. I'm pleased to hear you're so open-minded. Linus was sure he was terribly red. I can't believe I just said that. I can't either, to be honest. Who knew Linus Baker could be so you? Yes, well, I would appreciate it if it never left this house. Not to Zoe, and especially not to the children. Sal, of course, is old enough to understand such things, but I think it could destroy Chauncey's innocence. He frowned. Not that I'm sure how he could ever do. Does he even? Oh, no. Arthur snorted. Lucy is younger than Chauncey. Don't you think we should worry about his innocence too? Linus rolled his eyes. We both know that isn't a problem for him. Too right, but as I'm sure you're now aware, I wasn't speaking about that. The last word came out delightfully low, as if it curled around his tongue and teeth before exiting between his lips. Linus was instantly sweating. I was talking about the clack of typewriter keys. Linus blinked. Oh, that makes sense now that I think about it. I bet it does. It was surprising, but not because it existed at all, but because it was much louder than usual. Most nights it's faintly muffled because he's writing in his closet, the door shut. Linus understood now. If I overstepped, I apologize. Arthur held up a hand as he shook his head. Not at all. It was more than I could have hoped for. I like to think it means he's healing, and you played a part in that. Linus looked down at his hands. Oh, I don't think that's true. He needed to hear it spoken aloud, Arthur said, and I can imagine it coming from no better person. Linus jerked his head up. That's certainly not true. It should have come from you, he winced. That wasn't an admonishment. I meant that it wasn't my place to suggest such things. Arthur cocked his head. And why not? Because I shouldn't interact, at least not as much on a personal level. It's against your rules and regulations. Linus nodded as Sam Cooke gave way to the penguins singing about their earth angel. It caused his heart to stumble in his chest. It is. Why is that, do you think? It's what's required of someone in my position because it allows me to remain impartial, unbiased. Arthur shook his head. These children aren't animals. You aren't on a safari with binoculars watching them from a distance. How are you supposed to evaluate the children if you don't even take the time to know them? They're people, Linus, even if some of them look different. Linus bristled. I never suggested such a thing. Arthur sighed. I apologize. That was an oversimplification. I've dealt with prejudice for a long time. I have to remind myself that not everyone thinks that way. My point is you did something remarkable for a boy who came to us only used to derision. He listened to you, Linus. He learned from you, and it was a lesson he needed to be taught. I don't think he could have asked for a better teacher in that regard. I don't know about that, Linus said stiffly. I only did what I thought was right. I can only imagine what he's gone through, and you as well as master of the house, especially with wards so unique. Yes, Arthur said. There was something in his voice that Linus couldn't quite place. As a matter of this house, of course, it's why How did you put it shortly after your arrival? Don't let them leave? I could have worded that better, Linus admitted, especially knowing what I do now. No, I don't think you could have. It struck to the heart of the matter quite clearly. I prefer bluntness to obfuscation. Things get lost in translation, which is why when I tell you that I believe you helped Sal, I mean every word. I didn't ask him why he moved the desk. I only asked if he'd had help. He told me he had, and that it was you. It wasn't hard to fill in the blanks after that. It was merely a suggestion, Linus said, uncomfortable with the praise. I told him that while it was okay to want to feel small, he shouldn't forget that he can be big when he wants to. I hope it wasn't too out of line. I don't think it was. I think it was the right words at the right time. As I said before, he's healing. And with that healing comes trust. Though it needs to be well earned, I think you're on your way. Then I would feel honored. Would you? That doesn't sound like it's proper. I'm sure the rules and regulations would. Linus scoffed. Yeah, I hear you. Arthur smiled. You do. I like that very much, thank you. For? He shrugged. Whatever it is you're doing. That's vague. For all you know, I could be writing in my reports that this place isn't suitable, and neither are you. Is that what you're writing? Linus hesitated. No, but that doesn't mean I don't still have concerns or that my mind is made up. Of course not. But it does bring me to a certain point, if you still prefer my bluntness. Arthur folded his hands in his lap. I cherish it, in fact. You don't even know what I'm going to say. No, I don't. But you do, and I don't think you'd say it without having thought through it. Let's have it. Linus glanced at the record as it switched over to Buddy Holly, singing about why you and I, by and by, will know true love ways. The fact that it was yet another love song barely crossed Linus's mind. He was focused more on the fact that all these different singers were on the same record. He'd never heard of such a collection before. I think we should take the children on an outing off the island, Buddy Holly sang in the silence. Then, we? Linus shrugged awkwardly. You and Zoe and the children. I could come as well to keep an eye on things. I think it would do them good, just so they aren't so, he glanced at his report, isolated. And where would we take them? Linus decided to play along, even though Arthur would know the village better than he. I saw an ice cream parlor when I was in town last week. Perhaps a treat is in order. Or there was the movie theater, though I don't know if Sal would like it with how sensitive his hearing is. Being this close to the sea, I'm sure the village is a tourist destination, but given that it's off-season, there won't be as many people around. Maybe we could take them to a museum if one exists there. Give them a bit of culture. Arthur stared at him. Linus didn't like it. What? Culture, he repeated. Just an idea. He was feeling defensive again. He liked museums. He tried to go to the history museum near his house at least a few times a year on the weekends. He always found something new in everything so old. For the first time since he'd known him, Arthur looked uncertain. I don't want anything to happen to them. I don't either, Linus said. And if you'd allow it, I'll be there too. I can be quite protective when I need to be. He patted his stomach. There's a lot of me to try and take down. Arthur's gaze trailed down Linus's front, watching his fingers. Linus dropped his hand back to his lap. Arthur looked back at him. I know about the raft. Linus blinked. You do? How? Zoe said, It's neither here nor there. Your message in response was appreciated. More than you could probably know. I will speak with the children, perhaps the Sunday after next. It'll be the last full Saturday you're here. There won't be time after. You'll be gone. No, there wouldn't be. Time never stopped, though it often felt elastic. I suppose I will. Arthur stood. Thank you. Linus stood too. You keep saying that, and I don't know if it's deserved. Now the tips of their shoes did touch. Their knees bumped together, and yet Linus didn't take a step back. Neither did Arthur. I know you don't believe you do, Arthur said quietly, but I don't say things I don't mean. Life is too short for it. Do you like to dance? Linus exhaled heavily as he looked up at Arthur. The moon glows began to sing about the 10 commandments of love. I don't know. I think I might have 2 left feet, honestly. I highly doubt that. Arthur nodded. He reached up as if he were going to touch the side of Linus's face, but curled his hand into a fist and stepped back. He smiled tightly. Good night, Linus. Then he was gone, as if he'd never been there at all. Linus barely heard the door shut behind him. He stood in the empty house as the record spun slowly, singing songs of love and laughing. Just as he was about to turn and shut it off, there was a bright flash of orange light through the window. He rushed forward, peering out into the dark. He could see the outline of the trees, of the main house, of the garden, but nothing else. He decided he was tired, that his eyes were playing tricks on him, As he switched off the record player and began to turn in for the night, it never crossed his mind he'd forgotten to ask about the cellar door.